There is a jar in almost every kitchen on earth that no one thinks twice about. White crystals, unremarkable, cheap enough to leave sitting open on a counter. And yet if you could trace every grain back through time, you would find yourself standing in the middle of slave ships, royal treasuries, revolutionary battlefields, and boardrooms where scientists were paid to lie. This is not a story about a spice. It is a story about how a single wild grass rewired the economics, the politics, and the bodies of the entire human species. Long before it had a name, before anyone had thought to call it sweet, it was simply a plant growing in the humid lowlands of New Guinea. Botanists believe it had been growing there for tens of thousands of years, unnoticed by anyone with the tools to exploit it. Then, sometime around 8,000 years before the pyramids of Egypt were built, someone pulled a stalk out of the ground, split it open, and bit down. What they found was unlike anything else available to a Stone Age forager. Fruit could be sweet, honey could be sweet, but nothing offered concentrated, portable sweetness the way this plant did. Word of it spread the way most things spread in the ancient Pacific, canoe by canoe, island by island, across generations who had no writing system to record the moment but who nonetheless carried the plant with them as they migrated. For thousands of years, that was the entire relationship humanity had with sugarcane. People chewed it raw. There was no industry, no trade network, no concept of sugar as a commodity. It was closer to a treat than a technology. That changed only when the plant reached the Indian subcontinent, likely by the middle of the second millennium before Christ, carried along the same maritime routes that moved spices, cloth, and ideas between Southeast Asia and South Asia. It was in India that sugar stopped being a plant and became a product. Farmers and early chemists discovered that if you crushed the cane and boiled the juice down, the liquid would eventually crystallize into hard, granular chunks that could be stored, weighed, and transported without spoiling. This granulated form had a name in Sanskrit, and it is the distant ancestor of the English word we use today for hard sweets. For the first time, sweetness had a shelf life. It could be carried inland, sold in markets, and prescribed by physicians. Ayurvedic medical texts from this era treat sugar with something close to reverence, recommending it for digestive complaints, for fatigue, and for a long list of ailments that modern medicine would treat very differently. India had, in effect, invented the sugar industry roughly 3,500 years before anyone in Europe had tasted the stuff. Word of this strange substance eventually reached the Mediterranean world through conquest. When the armies of Alexander the Great pushed into the Indus Valley in the 4th century before Christ, his soldiers returned home with tales of a reed that produced something like honey without any bees involved. To a Greek audience raised on beekeeping as the only known source of concentrated sweetness, this sounded almost like a myth. For centuries afterward, sugar remained exactly that to most Europeans, a rumor, an occasional import, a luxury so rare that Roman physicians dispensed it by the spoonful as medicine rather than by the sack as food. A single pound could cost an ordinary laborer close to a month's earnings. It was not eaten. It was prescribed. The real transformation of sugar from curiosity to global commodity happened not in Europe but across the Islamic world during the centuries following the founding of the Abbasid Caliphate. Arab and Persian chemists, drawing on advanced knowledge of distillation and crystallization, perfected techniques for refining raw cane juice into crystals purer and whiter than anything India had produced. Agronomists carried the crop westward, planting it wherever irrigation and climate allowed, from the river valleys of Mesopotamia to the Nile Delta to the coastal plains of North Africa and, eventually, to Muslim Spain. Along with the plant traveled cookbooks, medical texts, and engineering knowledge for building mills powered by water and animal labor. By the time European knights arrived in the Levant during the Crusades at the close of the 11th century, sugar was already a familiar ingredient in the kitchens and pharmacies of the Islamic Mediterranean. The Crusaders who tasted it for the first time described it as something almost otherworldly, and they carried sacks of it home alongside the relics and spoils of Holy War. From there, the trade fell largely into the hands of Venetian merchants, who were perfectly positioned at the crossing point of Eastern and Western commerce. Venice imported raw sugar, refined it in facilities along its lagoon, and sold it across the continent at extraordinary markups, holding something close to a monopoly on the European sugar trade for roughly 2 centuries. In the courts of medieval Europe, sugar became a display of wealth in a way that is difficult to imagine today. Nobles commissioned elaborate sculptures made entirely of sugar paste for banquet tables. Royal households kept meticulous inventories of their sugar stores the way a modern treasury might track bullion. When Henry III of England celebrated his wedding in 1236, the royal accounts show a purchase of well over 300 pounds of sugar for the festivities, a quantity worth more than a knight could expect to earn in an entire year. Apothecaries locked their sugar away alongside opium and imported spices, because it was, quite literally, treated as currency. But there was a geographic problem baked into the entire arrangement. Sugarcane is a tropical plant. It will not grow in the damp, cool climate of England, France, or the Low Countries. Every grain consumed in Northern Europe had to be imported across enormous distances through a supply chain controlled by rival powers and vulnerable to war, piracy, and diplomatic disputes. European monarchs wanted a sweetener their own subjects could not simply chew from a stalk in their backyard, and they wanted it badly enough to reshape their empires around getting it. The solution began, almost accidentally, on a cluster of Atlantic islands. In the 15th century, Portuguese sailors and colonists established settlements on Madeira, the Canary Islands, and the small volcanic island of São Tomé off the coast of West Africa. Portuguese planters discovered that these islands offered nearly ideal conditions for sugarcane, and they set about building the first European-controlled plantations. What they needed next was labor, and a great deal of it, because cultivating cane is savagely demanding work. It requires long hours under tropical sun, harvest seasons that can stretch to 18 or 20 hours a day, and constant exposure to injury from cutting tools and grinding machinery. Convict labor and indentured European workers were tried first and abandoned quickly, unable to sustain the pace or survive the conditions. Portuguese planters turned instead to enslaved people captured along the West African coast, and the plantations of São Tomé became, in effect, a grim proving ground for a labor system that would soon be exported across an ocean. When Christopher Columbus made his second voyage to the Caribbean in 1493, he carried sugarcane cuttings with him. The soil and climate of the Caribbean basin turned out to be even better suited to the crop than the Atlantic islands had been, and European demand showed no sign of slowing. What followed over the next 3 centuries was one of the most consequential and brutal economic transformations in human history. The mechanics of sugar production in the colonial Caribbean were themselves a kind of engineered horror. Enslaved workers cut cane by hand with machetes under a tropical sun, then had to rush the stalks to grinding mills within hours, because the juice began fermenting almost as soon as it was exposed to air. The rollers that crushed the cane were powered by oxen, water wheels, or windmills, and they ran continuously through the harvest season. Feeding stalks into those rollers by hand was so dangerous that plantation owners kept axes mounted nearby, ready to sever a limb caught in the machinery before the entire body could be dragged through. The extracted juice was then boiled down in a sequence of copper kettles, each one hotter than the last, in a structure known as the boiling house, where temperatures regularly exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Burns from splashing, near boiling syrup were a routine hazard rather than an exception. Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands all raced to claim Caribbean and South American territory for sugar cultivation. Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, Cuba, and Brazil were transformed into what were essentially industrial sweetener factories disguised as colonies. By the middle of the 17th century, the tiny island of Barbados, smaller in area than many American counties, was producing more sugar than the entirety of Brazil and had become, pound for pound, the single most profitable colony anywhere in the British Empire, outstripping the economic value of all of Britain's mainland North American colonies combined. The human cost of this expansion is almost impossible to render in ordinary language. Historians estimate that somewhere in the neighborhood of 12.5 million enslaved Africans were forced across the Atlantic between the 16th and 19th centuries, and a substantial share of them were sent directly to sugar plantations, which had among the highest mortality rates of any form of forced labor in the historical record. On many Caribbean sugar estates, the average life expectancy of an enslaved worker after arrival was as short as 7 years. Plantation ledgers from the period reveal an appalling calculation: it was frequently cheaper for an owner to work enslaved people to death and purchase replacements than to invest in conditions that might have kept them alive. Sugar did not merely benefit from the transatlantic slave trade. It was the engine that made the trade economically viable at the scale it reached. By the 18th century, sugar had eclipsed tobacco, cotton, and every other colonial export to become the single most valuable commodity moving through the Atlantic economy. The fortunes it generated built townhouses in London, financed naval fleets, and underwrote wars fought on entirely different continents. Manufactured goods sailed from Europe to West Africa, where they were traded for captives. Those captives were transported to the Caribbean under conditions of extraordinary cruelty, and sugar, along with rum and molasses, sailed back to European ports to complete what historians call the triangular trade. Every leg of that triangle was financed by, and dependent on, the profits of sugar. Back in England, consumption patterns shifted dramatically as prices fell and supply grew. Around 1700, the average English person consumed roughly 4 pounds of sugar a year. By 1800, that figure had climbed to somewhere near 18 pounds annually. This was not simply a matter of changing taste. British merchants and political interests actively encouraged sugar consumption because the colonial economy generating it had become deeply entangled with domestic wealth and government revenue, yet the system that colonial powers had built also produced something none of them anticipated: organized, successful resistance. On the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the single most profitable sugar colony in the world at the time, enslaved workers rose up in 1791 in a rebellion that would eventually become the only fully successful large-scale slave revolt in recorded history. Over more than a decade of warfare against French, Spanish, and British forces, the formerly enslaved population of the colony fought for and won their independence, declaring the nation of Haiti in 1804 and becoming the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere. It is a story with a bitter irony at its center. The very system built to extract sugar wealth through bondage produced the revolution that ended it there. The shock waves from Haiti's independence reached far beyond the Caribbean. France had lost its most lucrative colonial possession virtually overnight, and Napoleon Bonaparte, who had entertained ambitions of a sprawling sugar empire in the Americas, was forced to abandon those plans. Facing the loss of Caribbean revenue and a British naval blockade that had already cut off much of his access to colonial sugar, Napoleon sold the vast Louisiana territory to the fledgling United States in 1803 for roughly $15 million, a price that worked out to a few cents per acre. The collapse of French sugar interests in the Caribbean is, in a very real sense, part of the reason the United States doubled in size almost overnight. Cut off from tropical sugar by the British blockade, Napoleon turned his attention to a discovery a German chemist named Andreas Marggraf had made decades earlier, that the humble beet, a plant that grows perfectly well in the cool soils of northern Europe, contains sucrose chemically identical to that found in tropical cane. Napoleon threw the resources of the French state behind beet sugar production, ordering tens of thousands of acres planted, offering cash incentives to farmers willing to convert their fields, and establishing dedicated institutions to improve crop yields. Within a decade, France was producing millions of pounds of sugar annually from a crop grown entirely on its own soil. For the first time in roughly 4,000 years, sugarcane's monopoly on sweetness had been broken by a plant that could grow in a temperate climate. The 19th century that followed brought a collision between two rival sugar economies, tropical cane and temperate beet, and the competition between them drove prices steadily downward even as production climbed. The Industrial Revolution accelerated the process further. Steam-powered mills could crush cane far faster than animal or water power ever had. Railroads moved raw material from field to refinery in hours rather than days. Refining techniques advanced to the point where manufacturers could produce crystals so fine and so white that they bore almost no resemblance to the coarse brown sugar first crystallized in ancient India. White sugar took on cultural associations with purity and refinement, while the less processed brown variety, despite being nutritionally almost identical, came to be seen as a lesser product. That it was around this period that sugar formed one of its most consequential partnerships, with tea. Britain was importing enormous quantities of tea from China, but tea on its own is bitter, and it took the addition of sugar to make it genuinely palatable to a mass audience. By the middle of the 19th century, British workers were drinking multiple cups of sweetened tea daily, and sugar imports to Britain roughly doubled in the space of just 2 decades. Parliament even lowered tariffs on imported sugar specifically to keep it affordable for the industrial working class, because sweetened tea had become, in effect, cheap fuel for factory labor. Sugar delivered fast, inexpensive calories to workers putting in 12 and 14-hour shifts, and industrialists had every incentive to keep it flowing, since a jam sandwich and a cup of sweet tea cost far less than a substantial meal. By the close of the 19th century, sugar had worked its way into nearly every corner of the Western diet: jams, baked goods, sweets, and bottled drinks. In 1886, a pharmacist in Atlanta began selling a sugary carbonated beverage that would eventually become the Coca-Cola Company, and within a few decades it was moving millions of bottles annually. Competitors followed. Candy manufacturing became a major industry. Breakfast cereal, originally marketed as a health food, was gradually reformulated with sugar coatings to boost sales. By 1970, the average American was consuming more than 100 pounds of sugar a year, roughly the body weight of a large dog, consumed grain by grain, year after year, by nearly every man, woman, and child in the country. What makes this era of sugar's history particularly troubling is not simply how much of it people were eating, but what the industry knew and chose not to disclose. Internal research conducted by major sugar companies as early as the 1950s pointed to a strong relationship between sugar consumption and heart disease. Rather than share those findings, the industry moved to suppress them. In 1967, an organization called the Sugar Research Foundation paid 3 Harvard researchers, in today's money, tens of thousands of dollars to produce a scientific review that downplayed sugar's role in heart disease and instead directed blame toward dietary fat. That review was published in one of the most respected medical journals in the world and went on to shape American nutritional guidance for the next 3 decades. Low-fat diets became the official recommendation of doctors and government agencies alike. Food manufacturers responded by stripping fat out of their products and quietly replacing it with sugar to preserve flavor, a substitution that likely contributed to a dramatic rise in obesity, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease over the following generations. The full extent of the deception did not come to light until 2016, when researchers at the University of California, San Francisco, uncovered internal industry documents laying out the strategy in plain language: fund-friendly research, sow doubt about unfavorable findings, and delay regulation for as long as the profits allowed. It was, almost point for point, the same playbook the tobacco industry had used to protect cigarette sales for decades. While that public health cover-up was unfolding, a parallel transformation was quietly reshaping what sugar even meant in American food. In the early 1970s, chemists working with American corn, a crop the country was producing in enormous surplus thanks to federal agricultural subsidies, perfected a process for converting corn starch into a cheap, easily transportable liquid sweetener known as high-fructose corn syrup. It blended more smoothly into processed foods and beverages than granulated cane sugar and cost less to produce. By 1984, both of the 2 largest soft drink companies in the United States had switched their American products from cane sugar to corn syrup, and within roughly a decade the new sweetener had displaced cane sugar in the overwhelming majority of processed foods sold in the country. Most consumers had no idea the underlying source of their sweetener had changed at all. The consequences of a century and a half of expanding sugar consumption are visible in public health data today. The average American now consumes roughly 17 teaspoons of added sugar daily, close to double or triple the amount recommended by cardiologists. Sugar hides in places few people think to check: pasta sauce, salad dressing, bread, flavored yogurt, which in many cases contains more sugar per ounce than a candy bar. A single can of regular soda alone can exceed an entire day's recommended limit. More than 4 in 10 American adults are now classified as obese. Tens of millions live with diabetes, and tens of millions more with prediabetic blood sugar levels. Heart disease remains the leading cause of death in the country, and while sugar is far from the only contributing factor, decades of research now confirm it as one of the largest. The picture is global, not merely American. Worldwide sugar production now exceeds 180 million tons annually, with Brazil leading production, followed closely by India, the same nation whose ancient farmers first learned to crystallize cane juice more than 3,000 years ago. The average person on the planet now consumes roughly 50 pounds of sugar a year, and that figure continues to rise as Western-style processed diets spread into developing economies. Some governments have begun pushing back. Mexico introduced a tax on sugary beverages in 2014, and consumption fell by roughly 12% within the first year. The United Kingdom followed with its own sugar levy in 2018, prompting major beverage manufacturers to reformulate their recipes with less sugar even before the tax took effect. Several American cities, including Berkeley, Philadelphia, and Seattle, have passed similar local measures, and early evidence suggests they modestly reduce consumption, even as the sugar industry has spent heavily to fight such policies wherever they arise. 10,000 years separate a forager biting into a wild stalk in the jungles of New Guinea from a shopper today scanning a nutrition label in a fluorescent-lit grocery aisle, checking for grams of added sugar. In between lies a story that touches nearly every major current in modern history: the medicine of ancient India, the scientific refinement of the Islamic Golden Age, the treasuries of medieval kings, the horror of transatlantic slavery, the fires of the Haitian Revolution, the doubling of the United States, the chemistry of Napoleonic France, the machinery of the Industrial Revolution, and the boardrooms where 20th-century science was quietly bought and bent. A plant that once cost a laborer a full day's wages for a single pound now sits, nearly weightless in cost, in almost every packaged food on every shelf in the world, still shaping bodies, economies, and governments in ways most people never pause to consider.